Today we're going to start with a tree farm. A pretty boring tree farm, I guess, using industrial foregoing. You know I'm not one for pleasantries. We're getting right to business and clearing land and putting down machines. In particular, I have a plant gatherer and plant sower. The gatherer is the harvesting machine and the sower is the planting machine. I can toggle the range to see how big of an area it's going to harvest, and I can also increase this with range add-ons. You can lock the slots in the plant sower if you want to have different types of crops growing in different regions, but since this is going to be one homogeneous tree farm, I'm not going to worry about that. Just make sure the area for each is overlapping completely. That way you're making the most of your range add-ons. Harvest too big and it will go too slowly, harvest too small and then you'll have extra unharvested stuff around the sides. While I am going to be pretty standard with my harvesting methods, the logistics are of course going to be a little complicated. Not really, I mean I've shown you these Project Red pipes before, you kinda know how they work already. Extractor chips take items out of inventories, responder chips allow those items to be put into those inventories. You've pretty much seen all of this before. And these machines take redstone flux, forge energy, so I have to use those cables instead of the IC2 ones. If we're going to be making all this wood, we might as well be able to make it look nice, right? If I make a woodworker, I can put in up to 2 different types of planks to make various patterns. They're just aesthetic, and you'll also need some wood polish to craft them. It's not easy to make it, but it's not that difficult either. It'll just be nice to have some different patterns of wood, though I do think the textures sometimes bug out a bit and accidentally. What, did you think the tree farm was just going to end like that? Of course not. Of course I have to overcomplicate it. By putting wood through a wood gasificator, I can turn the wood into charcoal and wood gas. Wood gas is a fluid fuel that can be burned in the liquid fuel generator. I don't know exactly what I'm going to use this extra power for, but I'll have the setup ready in case I want to use wood gas for anything when the time comes. This also means that the tree farm is 100% self-sustainable. I went ahead and cleaned some things up. Note that you can use microblocks to hide the pipes from Project Red. So, to explain how to hide each of the different types of pipes in this mod pack, you have microblocks for Project Red, you have chisels and bits for logistics pipes, and then you have the regular Buildcraft facades for the Buildcraft pipes. I've started work on a new wing at the base. This is going to be where I house my nuclear reactors, among other things. I've made a bunch of tunnels connecting them, and there will be 4 nuclear reactors here in total. Of course, I'll only be starting with one and I haven't even made it yet. I have plans for how this is all going to look. I'm going to be making a bunch of towers around here, since once I convert the reactors from EU reactors to steam reactors, I'm going to need a bunch of towers to process all of that steam into electricity. And then I'll have a main tower in the center for more automations and machines and such, because there's only so much room out here in the factory floor. Hey, wait a second, what's this? An apology? Well, I guess I was given some gifts. This is a nice letter. Well, I guess I'll have to thank Octron when I see him next. Good to know that he and Kuromu are kinda managing themselves. There's just so much for me to do. And he's saying that he gave me some new workstations. Oh, that's interesting. I think they're gonna be very similar to the Woodworker, considering that's where he drew the inspiration for making them from. Might have stolen my materials to make it happen, but I'll forgive that. Got some new pigments too. I guess he's been busy breeding the flowers while I've been off doing techie things. Yeah, as expected, these other workstations take in colored types of whatever material they are and then combine them into various patterns and designs. Well, that's really cool. I might make use of this a little bit. At some point I'll have to start automatically farming the flowers for him. For right now, we have other things to work on today. This will make a nice sealant though for the reactor area. It'll be insanely expensive for EU to use it a lot, but I'd like to set up a teleporter to get into the reactor area. You know, so it's all blocked off and clean. It's effectively radiation shielding or something. Ignore the hole in the wall that I'll be using in the meantime. Also, do note that teleporter cost scales with how many items you have in your inventory. To handle a lot more recipes per crafting machine, I'm going to be upgrading my Tier 4 chassis to Tier 5. While Tier 4 can only hold 4 recipe slots, Tier 5 can hold 8. It will greatly cut back on the number of machines I need for things. But of course, in a mod pack like this, there are only so many required recipes that I need to automate. While we're in the process of improving things around the base, I'd like to make a chest that stores a bunch of intermediates. This way, the system doesn't have to craft full things from the start every time. Especially helpful for expensive things like nuclear reactors. I can use a logistics pipe chassis with a provider module and an active supplier module to constantly keep a chest stocked of whatever I need it to be stocked with. Then the provider allows it to still be accessed by the rest of the network. This will be handy for things like circuits, advanced alloy, carbon plates, as well as other things that I might want to request from the system for me, like logistics pipes components. You know, chassis, modules, and the like. I don't want an infinite stock though, that would just waste all of my ingredients. So a stack or so of everything should be sufficient. If I want more, I can add more stacks. Now, nuclear reactors in this mod are somewhat complicated. My reactor designs are nowhere near perfect, but they get the job done. But I don't want to find out after the fact that my design wasn't very good, and come back to find a crater where my base was, or get caught up in the blast. That's where the reactor planner comes in. It's effectively the same as a full-size reactor, except it's a single-block machine that simulates what a reactor is going to do. You can fill as many or few of the grid slots as you'd like, and then you can compile it and run it and see what happens. It will keep track of a bunch of relevant statistics for you. So let's get started by putting in a single uranium cell into the reactor. It's only making 15 EU per tick, but there's no cooling going on in the reactor, so the heat's still going to build up. The reactor can only take so much heat, so if I put some heat plating in, it will be able to last longer. But we don't want to have it support more heat, we want it to remove the heat. There are designs that might want to keep a high heat in the reactor, but we're not worrying about that for the time being. This is just going to be a simple EU reactor. So instead of a plating, let's put in a heat vent and see what happens. Before, you might have noticed that the fuel rod didn't actually deplete all the way. This means that the reactor would have melted down. Now, instead, the fuel rod is what goes away, which is what we want. I've set the simulation speed to its maximum of 1000 times speed, so this way we can see the end result quicker. Every component has its own type of heat rating. The singular uranium fuel rod makes 4 heat per tick. The singular heat vent removes 6 heat per tick. The rod is going to send all of its heat into the heat vent, and then the heat vent dissipates that heat out from the reactor. The general rule for heat is that it's only shared between touching components, or between those components and the reactor hull, if it is one of the specific types of component that is designated to react with the hull. So let's just try putting in 2 fuel rods and see what happens. 4 plus 4 is 8, 6 plus 6 is 12, and 8 minus 12 is negative 4, right? Wrong. You might have noticed that the active EU is not 30, but 60. That's because touching reactor rods increase the radioactivity and thus make more heat and more energy. So the 2 little heat vents aren't going to cut it anymore. If I put in another 2 heat vents, it will now be able to support the extra heat because that doubled heat value is able to be compensated for. Now, you've noticed that there are extra big fuel rods as well as the singular ones. Double and quad fuel rods are essentially having touching singular fuel rods crammed into one space. This means that they generate all of the heat and energy that would have been made otherwise. Thus, it stands to reason that those 2 singular fuel rods are going to make the same energy and heat as the dual one, and thus it will need the same number of heat vents to disperse all of the heat that it's making. But it's not just the total that's present within the reactor. If the heat from the fuel rods can't reach all of the heat vents are going to break when they overheat. Heat vents don't just disperse heat, they actually store and absorb some of it. Let's pretend that one heat vent is flanked on either side by fuel rods. Each of them is generating 4 heat per tick. It's receiving 8 heat per tick but can only disperse 6. So there's a net gain of 2 heat per tick, meaning that it will break after 500 ticks as it can only store 1000 heat units. And once it's broken, it just disappears so it stops venting. If the heat has nowhere to go, it's going to enter the reactor hull, and obviously we don't want that. I'll show off a not very efficient, but much more powerful setup. This will be using quad uranium rods, overclocked heat vents, and component heat exchangers. Overclocked heat vents take out a whopping 36 heat from the reactor hull per tick, but it can only get rid of 20 heat from itself. If left unchecked, it's going to overheat. Component heat exchangers only exchange heat between touching components. These work well together as you can take heat out of these overclocked heat vents and give it to other vents. I'll quickly go over what all the types of components in the reactor do. First up are all the fuel cells. These, as you expect, make radioactivity, heat, and electricity, depending on the type of reactor. Redstone-enriched cells are more powerful and efficient, as they release 2 neutrons per tick, emit double the power, but they also only last 80% as long. Blaze cells are very hot. They're like the uranium cells, but they make way more heat. Ender pearl cells are different in that they interact with all 8 surrounding instead of just the 4 orthogonal surrounding components in the cells. Nether star cells produce 10 times the power as the uranium ones, almost 5 times the heat, and also release 2 neutrons like the redstone. Last we have charcoal. It produces less power but also lasts a lot longer. Beyond that we have the 10K, 30K, and 60K coolant cells, which absorb their respective amounts of heat and are effectively big batteries but don't vent themselves. However, you can use vents to remove heat from coolant cells. What you can't use vents to remove heat from is condensators. There are 2 varieties, redstone and lazuli. They need to be refilled with redstone and lapis respectively, though the lapis one can use redstone for less efficiency. Heating cells make heat. More on that in steam reactors. As discussed, heat vents get rid of heat. They all have different stats. You can read the wiki for more information. There are electric versions of these heat vents, and they're able to dissipate twice as much heat, but they will take some of the energy from the reactor output in the process. And since it's special, the component heat vent doesn't have heat storage. It only dissipates 4 heat per tick from its surrounding components. Heat exchangers exchange heat between touching components and/or the hull. The different types of reactor plating modify the reactor. The regular reactor plating is an all-around one that raises the heat a little bit and removes the explosion power a little bit, but the heat capacity reactor plating increases the heat by a lot, and the containment reactor plating reduces the explosion power by a lot. Neutron reflectors increase the radioactivity of a single cell as if a fuel rod was there, but don't generate any actual heat by itself. And then we have a bunch of depleted cells. We'll worry about depleted cells when we actually have some. Now I'll actually place down one of the nuclear reactors. You can place down the nuclear reactor block itself, but all the chambers have to be attached to that nuclear reactor. Also be absolutely sure that none of them are over a chunk boundary. Otherwise it will break your design and often lead to a meltdown. I've gone ahead and set the actual reactor up. Do note that nuclear reactors output extreme voltage, so you're going to need to use EV cabling, which is called HV cabling for some reason. It's the stuff made of refined iron. And then send that into an HV transformer where you can use your glass fiber cables and MFSUs and stuff. And step it down from there to use with your actual regular machines, of course. Reactors require a redstone signal to activate, so once you flip it and turn it on, it will start making power and heat. I would generally watch what you're doing to make sure that you didn't make any mistakes so that you don't end up with a crater, or at least make a backup. You'll want to make sure you're using the power from the reactor though, so I would set up an MFSU to emit redstone if it is less than half full, so that it turns the reactor on if it is less than half full, and then turns off when it is more than half full. This will have it hover in a comfortable power range. But you can only do this with safe designs. We'll get into more dangerous ones later. In order to make further pursuits in magic, I'm going to need to start farming crystals. Quarrying is getting me a large chunk of them, but I want to start making more of my own. So I'm going to sidetrack on a method I don't even end up using very much. If I make the type of crystal you can replant onto stone, it will slowly take in Vs from the environment if there's a surplus and increase the number of crystals in its cluster. This is an extremely slow process, and there are plenty of better ways to get more crystals. But I'm still going to try to devote a chunk towards farming them. It's a mechanic within the game, so I might as well give it a shot. I made some night vision goggles. Not really much else to say, I just wanted to bring up that I made some. So right now we're restricted to however much Vs is going to be present within a chunk. But sometimes we need more than that. So how do we bypass this cap? Well, that's where Vs batteries come in. When the chunk is above 90% Vs capacity, the Vs batteries will start taking in Vs from the environment. Actually, it might be 95. If it drops below 75, or you give it a redstone signal, it will start removing the Vs and putting it back into the environment. So what we can do is we can set up a timer where the Vs gets taken in by the batteries, it restores back to normal levels, and then we use the redstone to turn it on, and all of the Vs batteries drain. To assist with that, I have a Vs regenerator. It will add more Vs into a chunk, passively, as long as the chunk isn't full already. When a surplus of Vs is in a chunk, it has a very small chance to encourage the crystals to grow more. They'll grow up to 4 crystals total, then they'll have a chance to spread. All of these chances are incredibly low though, so you're going to want a lot of them firing to make sure you have it going at a decent rate. I guess while I'm here, I can also upgrade my Omni tool to a Thaumium grade. I'll have to re-enchant it. It doesn't keep the enchantments it had. I don't even think it's going to be that much better, but an upgrade's an upgrade. Time to pointlessly clear out the chunk to make that crystal farm. Again, pointless because, well, I don't end up really doing much with it in the end. It'll be neat to have, though. I'm going to use the IC2 miner to mine out the chunk, and I can power it with the nuclear reactor right above it. If nothing else, this will give me more resources. Remember that by crafting it with an advanced circuit, I can change the quarry's range, and I can go both up and down, so in this case I want to shrink the range just to fit within the chunk. It'll leave an ugly gap around the edges, but I'll have to mine that out manually. Back in the day, we had these things in the Red Power mod called redstone pneumatic tubes, or I guess they were just redstone tubes. If you gave the pipe a redstone signal, it would power all the adjacent redstone pipes, and then those would activate whatever machines they were touching. This still exists in Project Red, but you need to insert strips of redstone block into the tubes in order for them to have this functionality, much like you can insert strips of wool into them to filter them by color. As for the actual design of the farm, I'm going for a checkerboard layout with block breakers on one parity and regular stone on the other parity a block above it. I also have to fill in all the block spaces underneath the stone with some type of non-stone block to make sure the crystals don't spread down there, as crystals can only spread onto stone and stone adjacent blocks. Dirt, wood, etc. are all safe. But some machines, if they have stone-like properties, like the block breakers, might actually allow for crystal growth, so be careful. To help with construction efforts, I can upgrade my jetpack into an advanced electric jetpack. This has something called extreme hover mode, which is better than regular hover mode in that I don't descend while it's activated. It will make building outward a lot easier. I should probably get around to upgrading my energy crystal to a Lapitron crystal as well, complete with using a tier 3 charge pad, as Lapitron crystals can only be charged in tier 3 charging devices. I should elaborate though on how I'm automating this crystal farm. I'm using a combination of a timer, a toggle latch, and a Thaumic dioptra. The timer exists to turn the system on and off, to make sure that the batteries get the redstone signal that makes them expel all of their Vs. But when the system gets low enough on energy, that's when the dioptra tells the state cell to change. Once it passes below a particular threshold, which is dependent on the amount of ore in the chunk, it will switch the toggle latch and allow the Vs batteries to collect Vs once more. Then the Vs regenerators replenish the Vs in the chunk, and everything goes back to normal, repeating the cycle. And the timer can also restart the system if the dioptra doesn't detect a Vs change that's significant enough. Do note that I have to invert the signal to make it work. The whole point is that the Vs in the chunk goes under the desired level, rather than above it. I can also hook all of the redstone pipes up to the timer network, as I don't want it harvesting them too quickly before crystals have a chance to grow. Remember that growth is a lot faster than spreading. All of this extra Vs in this chunk is going to cause flux issues, so naturally I'm going to have to set up a flux condenser to manage that. We've seen the flux condenser before, but I can also take that vidium that it produces and automatically centrifuge it into praying contatio and perditio, which both get used up and consumed by the condenser, effectively making a kind of rebate on the flux that you're removing. I'll have to make a dedicated setup for Vs production in a bit, but for right now we're just going to have to manually feed it. Do note that if the flux gets to more than 5% capacity in the chunk, it's going to stop all Vs crystals from growing. And if the Vs amount in the chunk gets down low enough, it's going to start removing some of the crystals. They'll never completely break, but they are going to slowly go away, down to 1 crystal, instead of the 4 that they should be. Now it's time to capture some mobs. I can use a containment spell on the mob with a warded jar in my inventory, not in my offhand, I learned my lesson later, and I can capture the mob and I'll be able to augment it. There are a few different mobs of interest, all of them are basic passive animals, but some of them might be a little annoying to get. For right now I'll pick up some sheep. Remember the curing vat that I made? Well, we're finally going to use it. If I put that modified matrix on top and activate it, it will look kind of like the runic altar. The same basic rules apply. It takes in Vs from jars, it takes items on pedestals, and it has stability. Right click on it with the mob you want to modify and it will appear inside the vat. So what am I going to infuse this sheep with? I'm going to make it auto shear. This means that it will shed its coat whenever it grows one, thus automating the process of producing wool. I'll have to set up a collection system to actually obtain the wool, but this is my method of choice for wool farming. Because there aren't enough of those in this mod pack already. I go through a few different design ideas for how I want to collect the items from this farm. The first one I attempted was to use Industrial Foregoing's conveyor belts, but eventually I discovered that, strangely, the self-shearing sheep have a hitbox, so the sheared wool actually gets put on top of them. And since it's on top, it's not going to touch the belt, even though it looks like it touches the belt, and it's not going to actually get picked up. To quickly explain these belts, though, they take item entities that are on the ground and push them in the direction they're pushing. It's not that complicated. You can also use different types of upgrades, like insertion or extraction upgrades, to take items in or out of inventories. as well as a whole slew of other things that I'm not going to go over because I'm not using them. And you probably won't use them either, they're not that great. There are just better options for things present within the pack. Also, there's a bit of a rendering issue, I think, with the insertion upgrade. It's supposed to have a little tunnel at the end of the belt, but because I can't see it, I was unsure about exactly where it was. It will go at the end of the belt, you just have to properly configure it. Instead of that, though, I can make a kinetic attractor. This pulls item entities, or pushes, depending on how you have it configured, and since the item is sitting on top of the sheep, it will pull off cleanly onto the block next to it, though I will need some way to stop the sheep from climbing over the block. I used an item grate, but you could probably just use a slab too. I can then use a hungry chest, which will automatically pick up items. I could also have just used a hopper, but hungry chest. I will eventually replace this as well, but at least this one worked. Note that the attractor requires a redstone signal, and its hitbox is at the bottom of it. Broken hitboxes seem to be a trend with this stuff. Finally, something that works properly. An obsidian pipe will pick up items that touch it, but if you use an engine to give it a pulse, it will start picking up items in a wider range. The regular redstone engine will do for this purpose. It will make a small cone that comes in the opposite direction of the pipe it's leading into, so in this case it's pointing at the ground. While having a supply of wool is nice, this wasn't really my goal in the first place. Using just 2 ingredients, I can have all 6 types of basic Essentia in about equal ratios. Note that the ratio is what I'm after here. The wool contains mostly Bestia and a bit of Fabrico, but Bestia decomposes into Victus and Modus, Victus turns into Terra and Aqua, Modus turns into Air and Ordo, and then I have Ice, which is made of Ignis and Perdicio. And by centrifuging all of these, I can get all 6 primal aspects at the same time. The Fabrico can then get sent to the Flux condenser. Of course, while the ideal ratio is 50-50, that's not how it might actually turn out in practice. But over a long enough time frame, it should hopefully even out, at least enough to where I can use all of it effectively. The difference would have to be like 250 plus on one end, which is statistically very unlikely. And if the ratio gets too bad, I can always empty a jar. Since I'll be generating a lot of flux, I'll need a way to deal with rifts whenever they show up. This is where the causality collapser comes in. It's like a grenade that blows up flux rifts. They can be a little pricey to make, but it could also be a lot worse. I've mostly cleaned up Kuromu's lab and put things back where they're supposed to be, but I think a good first use of the causality collapser is to get rid of that rift I found over here a while ago. You know, the one he showed me. Well, I guess that means he found it, but you get the point. If I were to throw the causality collapser at the rift, it will close, and oh, I get some void seeds out of it. That's interesting. I wonder what these can be used for. We did find that one before in that nether fortress. Not the fortress, like that tower with the tunnel underneath, remember that? I'll have to investigate them more later. The more exposure to all this flux I get, though, the worse my symptoms become. I've suffered a bunch of adverse effects, and while they are always temporary, I am worried about what might happen if that gets really bad. This one in particular is an insatiable hunger. It means I have to eat some zombie brains to make it go away. Such a vile food source, though, doesn't sit well in the human body. I can feel it trying to make its way into my thoughts. Ugh, this fiend again. Can't even tell if the thing is real or not. Seems to satisfy my brain if I just try to kill it. I have no idea if it actually does anything or not, but it can seem to harm me. Don't know if that's just a mental shock, though. Maybe I can fight off this insanity by reducing the amount of flux I'm producing. Feels like an awfully good scientific approach to this, right? I've set up a remote beast-producing base. The ideal ingredient here is something pure and plentiful, and I think ice fits that excellently. As far as pure ingredients go, it's probably the best that's both easy to get and dense. It contains 20 gellum? I don't know. All this research these people made and left for me, and they can't even tell me how to pronounce the stupid words. Would it have killed them to make a glossary? The mechanics of this system are quite interesting, though. A regular block breaker can't actually keep the Vs preserved when it breaks a jar, so I need to have something that can simulate a player breaking it instead. By placing down a break seal, and restricting the area to only the block in front of the seal, I can have a golem come and break the block whenever I want it to. This is controlled with redstone. The comparator determines how full the jar is, and when the jar passes a particular desired threshold, it sends a redstone signal to the seal, and then that activates the breaking golem, which breaks the jar. That then gets picked up by the hopper and put into the ender chest, and I now have an ender chest full of mostly full Vs jars. I can have as many destinations as I'd like, and setting it up is actually quite simple. All I need to do is get a block placer, place down the filled jar, read it, and when the jar empties, I can break the block and put it back into a different ender chest, which sends it back into the ender chest at the start of the system on the other end, and the cycle can continue. This means that I can efficiently remove flux from pretty much any chunk I want, as long as I can keep up with the rate demand. Might end up having to make a few more of these, but we'll see how things go. This also doesn't account for when the filters clog. I'll have to make a system that automatically maintains that. The next thing I'd like to make requires Gellum as one of the Essentia that's used, but I still want to prioritize production of Ignis and Perdicio. So how would I accomplish that? Well, I can read the amount of Essentia being stored in one of the jars, and then send the signal over to a tube valve. This will shut that direction when the redstone signal is active, meaning that no suction can go in that direction. Thus, the direction with higher suction then becomes the other destination, and it will fill the other jar accordingly. It's a little tricky working with Essentia because it doesn't work like a normal fluid, or item for that matter. But once you get the hang of it, it's not that bad, as long as you know what you're doing with the system. There are still things that you can't accomplish in a simple manner. The product in question here is crystallized UU matter. It takes Gellum, Vitreous, and Praincontatio. The Praincontatio can come from upstairs, transported via Essentia mirror. The Vitreous is being made on site from glass, and we've already discussed how to get Gellum. This opens up a type of material transmutation, in which I can get large quantities of items by using different sets of ingredients. Yes, I could make a laser drill. Yes, I could get into EMC. But we're doing it this way, and that's that. Do note that if you're going to craft things automatically with the Essentia transfuser, you need to make sure it's not placed on a tube and is instead placed directly onto the Thaumatorium. That way you don't end up with extra Essentia in the tubes, which would otherwise clog up the system. Crystallized UU matter has a bunch of recipes, but the one I'm looking after is uranium ore. I did use Craft Tweaker to modify these recipes. You'll notice some of them have larger stack outputs than one for the item. This doesn't actually work, as you can only hold one item on a pedestal at a given time. So as far as getting material costs is concerned, I've swapped them out for end ores, and then use end ores in a processing recipe chain to get the actual product that I want. The numbers are the same, and I think this is fair. I'm probably like one of 3 people playing with Thaumcraft in this mod pack, so it makes sense that nobody finds these things that I would consider bugs that should have been fixed. You probably also saw that all of these recipes take all 6 primal aspects in even ratios. Gee, I wonder why I wanted all the primal aspects in ratios. Almost like I planned this out. Remember mob capturing? Well, I'm looking into other ways to acquire resources, and you can capture mobs easier if you make them weaker. By using a splash potion of poison, I can get all of the mobs down to 1 HP. Then capturing them is very simple. And yes, at this point I finally figure out that you need the jars in your inventory and not in your offhand. Since the UU matter method doesn't make a super reliable way of getting gold, I'd like to try what other alternatives there are. One such option is the golden chicken. It seems to lay golden nuggets, so let's make one and try it out and see how it goes. I should have mentioned it before, but you have to reapply the containment spell to a jar with a mob in it to let the mob out. I also think I neglected to mention before that you can right click on the vat with the jar to get the mob back out. So I'll just let this chicken out and... oh. Oops, I didn't think about that. Take 2. You'll want to let the mob out away from all the blocks that it might suffocate in. Then you can use a mob imprisonment tool to move it. This chicken sure is generating slowly, and it seems to be the same amount of time as it takes to make an egg. I guess it is passive, but I feel like I've set this up too late for it to really be useful. I'll have to investigate other methods. In order to make more gold, I'm going to need more Essentia, as my next idea requires a lot of it. So, in order to do this, I think I'm going to want a pure source of some of the more complex types of Essentia. This is where the jelly rabbit comes in. It's another mob mutation like the golden chicken, and rabbits are kinda hard to find. Thankfully, with the tablet of necromancy, I can just summon a rabbit using mob essences. Rabbits are summoned with Victus, Bestia, and Modus. Victus comes from chickens, Modus comes from pigs, and both of them make Bestia, so you don't have to kill any rabbits to make more. The type of crystal you use in the recipe will determine what aspect the rabbit has. I'd like to start with Permutatio, a common ingredient in upcoming recipes. Naturally, I'll need to make a pen for the rabbit so it doesn't get out, and you'll need to make it 2 fences high, instead of just 1. At least, the rabbit got away with only 1. I also eventually discover that putting it in the same chunk as the crystal farm was actually a bad idea. It drains Vs from the surrounding environment, like the crystals do, except it just slurps the entire thing up. You can then punch the rabbit or shear it to remove the jelly layer. and then put it through the Essentia smeltery to get the corresponding type of Essentia. Thankfully, I can use Industrial Foregoing's Rancher to do the shearing for me, much like sheep. You could probably also use a golem with shears or something, but this is a very easy way of doing it. Is this a very fast method? Not really. I might move it into a different chunk and do some experimenting. It is still passive pure Essentia, so I can't complain about that. With all of that Essentia squared away, it's time to make infused seeds. This sounds particularly promising if what the book says is correct, and being attacked by taint and flux in this area means I'm gonna have to clean things out, but I can do that off camera. So if I plant these seeds into the farmland, oh, okay, and I grow it, and it makes a type of infused grain. Well, this is pure Essentia. I wonder if multiple types of seeds work like this. There were 6 basic types of them. One for each aspect. I'll have to grow each and see what happens. Would be nice to have a pure source of ordo, right? But it also seems to have left a residue in the soil. So if I keep growing these seeds, they'll keep leaving their residue. I need to inspect this more. So then, what happens if I were to grow the different types of seeds on other types of residue? It seems to... oh! It's made Lux seeds. That's very interesting. The aspects combined. Does this work for every aspect? And what does it make when I grow it? Oh, it makes a lot more complex items. They're not pure items, which might be preferable in some way, but more complex items still contain that aspect. And more importantly, it bypasses a type of auto-crafting. Alright, so let's try growing some ordo seeds and see what happens. Huh. It makes glass. That's, disappointing, to say the least. Maybe now that I know about complex crops, though, what if I were to put ordo and ignis together? That would make potentia, right? Oh, and this grows and makes redstone. That's very useful. And it doesn't require any of the complex, annoying nuances of IC2 crops or bees. I'll have to keep growing these and see what I find. I have high hopes for metallum. That should make metal objects, right? There are a whole lot of metal objects, but it'd be really convenient if it just made ingots. Yes. Oh, it seems to be primarily making gold ingots. I don't know if that's all it can make or not, but still, I was pursuing a better method to get gold. I've hooked up the underwater dome's flux condenser to the Essentia production network that's making Gellum, so I can have an automated amount of Essentia to clean up this chunk. It's important that the flux condenser is running at all times in the underwater base because of its very high flux density. It's pretty much always making a little bit, and it'll only get worse the bigger it gets. I did forget to hook up the ender chest, the lower one that is, so I end up wasting some jars, but oops, I eventually spot the issue. It's also rather handy having a regular filter only export one item, because this means I don't have to worry about overflow in the block placers. Victus makes eggs, Mortuus sometimes makes magic tallow, but combined they make Spiritus, and when Spiritus is combined with Ignis, you get Humanus, and Humanus makes Golem seals. This will allow me to skip a lot of crafting, by just having free access to pretty much any type of Golem seal I like. I keep trying to find a way to use the kinetic attractor, and it just keeps failing because of mob hitboxes. So I'm just using a golem to do all the harvesting and collecting from this farm. The dispensers are on a timer, and they automatically deploy bone meal on the metallum crops. This effectively means I have a gold farm. With Alienus, it also makes ender pearls and eyes of ender, which is nice. But I won't be running that full time. Note that if you have some type of item user and not dispensers, you can use forestry fertilizer, which might be cheaper for you. But dispensers work with bone meal and they don't work with fertilizer, so that's what I've gone with. I'm then going to be recycling the gold into scrap metal. Scrap metal is much better than normal scrap in the mass fabricator, and currently I am attempting to use UU matter to make bones, but ultimately it was not a net positive process, so I'll be resorting to other methods to get bones. I've also set up another nuclear reactor. This one is dedicated to making the mass fabricator run. Like I said before, I was trying to use this UU matter to make bones, but it didn't work out. I still want a lot of UU matter though, that was part of the point of this, so it's not like this is going to be useless for us. I don't believe I ever showed off filtered importing, so if you hold down a specific key, check your keybinds, and right click while holding the filter, you'll open its GUI. You can then place items into the filter slots to, well, filter it. In this case I only want gold. I could take the iron, metallum does rarely make iron, but we want the gold. Also, if I decide to farm anything else in here, it won't take things like ender pearls. I'll be getting my bones from a skeleton spawner, specifically a wrath cage. You'll need an imprinting crystal and then kill a mob with the diabolist's fork with the imprinting crystal in your inventory. It will then filter it to that mob. In my case, skeletons. Yes, I have a skeleton spawner already. To craft the wrath cage, I'm going to need Dissidia Essentia. There aren't many good sources of this, so I'll have to use dyed beds for the time being. Yes, you heard me right. Dyed beds, not undyed ones. White beds won't work. Why? Who knows? To make this even more of a joke, I'm going to be upgrading my Nano Saber to have looting 3. This means that the free skeleton farm is doing a great job, and it's going to do an even better one. Meanwhile, my other skeleton farm is for other purposes. Don't worry, infrastructure is reusable. I think making this mob farm is going to have some rather interesting results. To construct the mob farm, I'm going to be making a box with a 9x9 footprint centered upon the wrath cage. Obviously, the wrath cage is going to go in near the end. I then have some water acting as an item collection, and I can put a hopper or something at the bottom of the hole. Beyond that, I'll cover everything up with item grates. Item grates can be closed if you right-click on them. But since we don't want to close them, we want them to all be open all the time, we're just going to lay out a full grid making a floor. Now you can right click on the wrath cage with your imprinting crystal, and it doesn't consume the crystal, so you get that back, and it will set the cage to the type of mob you want. Again, in this case, skeletons. It's not just going to spawn stuff on its own for free though. It's going to require one of 3 different types of Essentia to function. You can pick between Mortuus, Dissidia, and Ira. Of these, we've already discussed the impracticality of Dissidia, so we can either go the Ira route and automate TNT, or just use bones and feed it back with Mortuus. But aren't I trying to make bones and profit from them? Yes, of course. You can just use the centrifuge on more complex things to get Mortuus, or I could use one skeleton farm to feed the other skeleton farm. And gee, isn't it convenient that I have Mortuus coming in from a different thing that's using Victus? So I can make both beef and bones with the same products. But what is the killing mechanism going to be? That's where Liquid Death comes in. Liquid Death will kill mobs, and it will also generate Essentia crystals depending on the type of mob that's killed. For skeletons, this will be Humanus, Exanimus, and Terra. Different mobs will of course make different things. There are a number of mobs that might interest you, especially since you're still getting their normal drops. But if I feed Essentia into the wrath cage and turn it on, it'll start making skeletons, and they'll die, and their drops will get sent down to the water, that gets pushed in the hole, and out comes all of the bones, arrows, and crystals. And since this is not a player kill, it won't be generating bows or anything annoying like that. But if you want player-only kills, obviously this isn't going to work for you. It's a trade-off. I'll then send the bones back to the base and process them into bone meal, which then, in turn, will stock the farm. And we have tons of gold, isn't that great? Or should I say tons of scrap metal? I've come up with one last method for resource generation for today. The ore boar. This is an infused pig, which will generate ores from cobblestone. Now, I have a disclaimer. I went into the scripts of this mod pack, and I changed some things. The ore boar generates any dust or nugget that comes from a material that has an ore. This includes some resources that were not intended to be made like this. You were never intended to make diamonds or emeralds. So what did I do? I took them out. I did leave one weird one in there, but pretty much everything else is something standard. This does result in grossly different rates for some types of materials over others, but it's what I personally found to be balanced. If you want this thing to make diamonds and emeralds for you, go right ahead. It'll make their nuggets and you can craft them back into the proper, gems. Jobka did also mess with things a bit. It made some extra dusts and stuff that I didn't want it making. But how are we to feed it cobblestone, you ask? If you recall, the machine buffer can act as a cobblestone generator. This doesn't require any power to work, it will just generate cobblestone. I then put a gravity pipe on the bottom, and it will automatically extract the cobblestone out. This then gets fed to the pig, which then generates stuff, and it goes into the hoppers. I actually only need one hopper. I was trying to be nice to the pig and give it some room to walk around, but confining it to one space works too. I eventually settle on putting it on top of a slab on top of a hopper, because then the cobblestone that's being fed to it doesn't get picked up by the hopper, but the drops it produces do. But how am I to compress these nuggets and things together? We don't have any type of buffered compactor in this mod pack. Maybe not, but the Arcane Crafter actually does a decent job at this. Instead of making a whole bunch of logistics pipe stuff, all I need to do is have a supplier pipe fill in the exact number of 9 nuggets into the top chest. This then gets read by the crafter, which takes out those 9 nuggets, and puts the ingot into the bottom. I will be moving this, but this is a pretty compact way of turning ingots into nuggets without making a billion machines. So that's nuggets taken care of. What about dusts? The ones that smelt into ingots, I mean. Well, obviously I'm going to throw them in a furnace. I can then re-extract them into the network, and I'll get around to expanding the storage room in a little bit. But for right now, I'm simply supplying the furnace with all the dusts that are being produced, and then extracting them out with an extractor module. I could hook up the furnace to the grid, but I'll just use a solar panel in a bat box or two. It's not like I'm constantly producing these things. Well, I guess I am, but I'm not, like, using that much power. Alright, that should pretty much do it for everything the Ouroboros is producing. It took a little bit to make enough black hole units, but now I don't have to worry about storage for any of these components. I'm going to leave the ore processing where it is. I might consider replacing all the provider pipes on the ore processing with extractors, and just store everything in the black hole units, but for right now, things are okay. Now, this is making meteoric iron. I shouldn't have that yet, technically speaking, but I left it in. Kind of a pain in the butt to get normally. But where's the pig getting it from? Ooh, I don't know. Maybe it's from space. Maybe there's magic in space. Well, I'll have to go to space sometime and find out. It's a bit messy, but we've gotten some stuff done. One of these days I really need to just build things, you know? I have lots of unfinished builds around the base, and it's kinda ugly. For now though, thank you for watching. This has been Pick. I'm glad to have seen you, and I hope to see you again.